Hi, friends. Hi, folks. It's Sarah once again with Pride and Prejudice. So yesterday we met Mr. Collins, and that was a lot of fun. Hi, Jules. And we will be hearing more from him today, and also a new character. Hi, Alma. So, yes, we'll be doing chapter 15 through 18 today. I hope everybody is having a nice Tuesday. Yeah, it's nice and sunny here, and I'll get on with chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiencies of nature had been little assisted by education or society. The greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming in it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up, and had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank, and the veneration of her as his patroness, mingled with the very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his rights as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. Having now a good house and very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found one of them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by the common report. This was his plans of amends, or atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all his strictest notions of what was due to his seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet, before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes, that a mistress for it may be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughter, she could not take upon herself to say, she could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must just mention, felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely to be very soon engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done. Done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equal next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and a man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intentions of walking to Meryton was not forgotten, every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to be rid of him, and to have his library to himself, for thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaging with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet with little sensation of his house and gardens at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room in the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk. And Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his book and go. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in the shop window could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street under pretence of wanting something in the opposite shop, and fortunately just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town. He was happy to say had accepted a commission in the corps, and this was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favour. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably, when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them, and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. And Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they would come in, and in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest from their recent absence were particularly welcome. And she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, when, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about it if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop-boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts to Netherfield because the Miss Bennets were coming away, when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by the exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him home from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. She was watching him in the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation. But unluckily no one passed the window now except a few of the officers, who in comparison with the stranger were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunts promised and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also. If the family of Longbourn would come in the evening, this was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apology in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behaviour than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before, something he supposed must be attributed to his connection with them. Yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Chapter 16. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, and all Mr. Collins' scruples of leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening during his visit were most steadily resisted, the coach conveyed him and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation, and was then in the house. When this information was given, and they had all taken their seats, Mr. Collins was at leisure to look around him and admire, and he was much struck by the size and furniture of the apartment that he declared he had almost supposed himself in the small summer breakfast parlour at Rosings, a comparison that did not at first convey much gratification, but when Mrs. Phillips understood from him what Rosings was, and who was its proprietor, when she listened to the description of one Lady Catherine's dining rooms, and found that the chimney-piece alone had £800, she felt all the force of the compliment, and would hardly have resented a comparison with the housekeeper's room. In describing all of the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions of praise of his own humble abode and the improvements it was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentlemen joined them, and found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retell it all at her neighbours as soon as she could. To the girls, who could not listen to their cousin, and who had nothing to do but wish for an instrument, and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, the interval of waiting appeared very long. But it was over at last, however. The gentleman did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt she had neither been seeing him before, nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of the shire were in general a very creditable, gentlemanlike set, and the best of them were the present party. But Mr. Wickham was far beyond them, in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on its being a wet night and the probability of a rainy season, made her feel the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic that might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed likely to sink into insignificance to the young ladies. He certainly was nothing, but he had still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was by her watchfulness most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffins. When the card tables were placed, he had the opportunity of obliging her in return by sitting down to whist. "I know little of the game at present," said he, "but I shall be glad to improve myself for my situation in life." Mrs. Phillips was thankful for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight was received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, for she was the most determined talker, but being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets, and exclaiming after prizes to have attention for anyone in particular. Allowing for the common demands of the game, Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him. Though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told, the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. She dared not even mention that gentleman. His curiosity, however, was unexpectedly her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved. Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth, and then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "He is a man of very large property in Derbyshire, I believe." "Yes," replied Wickham. "His estate there is a noble one. I clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a more pleasant person, more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Elizabeth could not help but look surprised. "You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, after seeing, as you probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As much as I ever wish to be," said Elizabeth warmly. "I have spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." "I have no right to give my opinion," said Wickham, "as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I have known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial. But I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. Here you are in your own family." "Upon my word, I say there is no more here than I might say in any house in the neighbourhood, except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everyone is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favourably spoken of by anyone." "Ooh, I cannot pretend to be sorry," said Wickham, after a short interruption, "that that any man should be esteemed beyond their deserts. But with him, believe me, it does not often happen. The world is so blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high, imposing manner, and sees him only as he chooses to see himself. I should take him, even on my slight acquaintance, to be an ill-tempered man." Wickham only shook his head. "I wonder," he said, at the next opportunity of speaking, "whether he is likely to be in the country much longer." "I do not know. I have heard nothing of his going away when I was at Netherfield. I hope your plans in favour of the shire will not be affected by his being in the neighbourhood." "Oh, no, it is not for me to be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it gives me great pain to meet him. But I have no reason for avoiding him, but what I would proclaim to all the world, a sense of great ill usage, and most painful regrets at his being what he is. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I have ever known. I can never be in the company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behaviour to myself has been scandalous, but I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything, rather than be disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increased, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics, Meryton, the neighbourhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, and speaking of the latter especially with gentle but very intelligent gallantry. It was the prospect of constant society and good society, he added, which was my chief inducement to entering the shire. I knew it to be a most respectable, agreeable corp, and my friend Denny tempted me further by his account of their present quarters. The very great attentions and excellent acquaintance of Meryton has procured them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. A military life is not what I intended for, but circumstances have made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession, but I was brought up in the church. I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now. Indeed. Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the living in his gift. He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it. But when the living fell, it was given elsewhere. Good heavens! Cried Elizabeth. How could that be? How could his will be disregarded? Why did you not seek a legal redress? There was such an informality in the terms of the request as to give me no hope from law. A man of honours could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as merely conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claims to it by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Certainly it is that the living, and that it was given to another man, was, and no less certain it is that I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve to lose it. I have a warm, unguarded temper, and I may perhaps have sometimes spoken my opinion of him and to him too freely, but I can recall nothing more. But the fact is that we are very different sorts of men, and that he hates me. This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced. Some time or another he will be, but certainly not by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never deny or expose him. Elizabeth honoured him for such feelings, and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. But what, said she, after a pause, can have been his motive? What could have induced him to behave so cruelly? A thorough, determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better. But his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe, very early in his life. He had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, a sort of preference which was often given me. I had not thought Mr. Darcy as bad as this. I thought though I had never liked him, I never thought so very ill of him. I had supposed him to despise his fellow creatures in general, but I did not expect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued, I do remember him boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentment, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful. I will not trust myself on the subject, replied Wickham. I can hardly be just to him. Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed, to treat in such a manner the godson, the friend, the favourite of his father. She could have added, a young man, too, like you, whose very countenance must vouch for you, being amiable. But she contented herself with, and one, too, who had probably been his own companion from childhood, connected together as as I think you said in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do so much credit to. But he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, devoted all his time to the care of Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligation to my father and his active superintendence, and when immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing me. I am convinced that he felt it to be as much of a debt of gratitude to him as affection to myself. How strange, cried Elizabeth, how abominable! I wonder that the very pride of this Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you. If from no better motive than he should not have been too proud to be dishonest, for dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than any other feeling, but we are none of us consistent, and his behaviour to me, though it was a stronger impulse even than pride. Can such abominable pride as his ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, and to assist his tenants, and relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his father would have done. Not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from the popular qualities or lose influence of Pemberley House, is a powerful motive. He has also brotherly pride, which has given some brotherly affection, made him very kind and careful guardian of his sister. And you will hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best of brothers. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of Darcy, but she is too much like her brother. Very, very proud. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing, and I was extremely fond of her. And I've devoted hours and hours to her amusement. But she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand highly accomplished. Since her father's death, her home has been in London, where a lady lives with her and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first, and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How could Mr. Bingley, who seems good humour himself, and is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. Probably not. Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be conversable companion if he thinks it is worth his while. Among those who are all his equals, in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honourable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure. The whist party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered round the other tables, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter, and it had not been very great. He had lost every point, but when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he would consider the money as a mere trifle, and begged she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, said he, that when a person sits down at a card-table, they must take the chance of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubted many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters." Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Collins for a few minutes, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation was very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. "Lady Catherine de Bourgh," she replied, "has been very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters. Consequently, she is the aunt to the present Mr. Darcy." "No, indeed, I did not. I know nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connection. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday." "Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed she and her cousin will unite the two estates." This information made Elizabeth smile, though she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection for his sister and praise of himself, if he was already self-destined to another. "Mr. Collins," she said, "speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but for some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited lady." "I believe her to be both in the very great degree," replied Wickham. "I have not seen her for many years, but I well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She had a reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derived part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class." Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and continued to talking together with mutual satisfaction until supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attention. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him, and could think nothing but of Mr. Wickham, and what he had told her all the way home, but there was not time for her to even mention his name as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were silent, Lydia talking incessantly of lottery tickets, and of fish that she had lost and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, and had more to say than they could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. Yes, I know I probably shouldn't make Mr. Wickham sound like a bitchy drag queen, but that's how he sounds in my head. All right, chapter 17. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of him having really endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing therefore remained to be done but to think well of them both, to defend the conduct of each, and to throw into the account of an accident or mistake whatever could not be explained otherwise. "They have both," she said, "been deceived, I dare say, in some other way or other, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is, in short, impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alienated them without actual blame on either side." Very true indeed. Now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say on behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in this business? Do clear them too, or we shall be obliged to think ill of somebody. Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion. My dearest Lizzie, do not consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who has any value for his character, could be capable of it. Can his most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley being imposed upon than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave last night. Facts, names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in all his looks. It was difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think. But Jane could not think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed upon, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery where their conversation had passed by the arrival of the very person of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see their dear friend again, called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. No, I think that was my internet. No, it's B. It's definitely me. Am I working again? See if it crashes again. Okay, I think it's working. I'm going to go back to the prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as a given-in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured herself to be a happy evening in the society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother. And Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's looks and behaviour. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half of the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was at any rate a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. "While I can have many mornings to myself," said she, "it is enough. I think it is no sacrifice to join in occasionally in evening engagements. Society has claim on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody." Elizabeth's spirits were so high on the occasion that though she did often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement, for she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatsoever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh by venturing to dance. "I am by no means of the opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of this kind given by a young man of character to respectable people can have any evil tendency, and I am so far from objecting to dancing myself, that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all of my fair cousins in the course of the evening. And I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first two dances especially, a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause, and not to any disrespect for her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed to being engaged by Mr. Wickham for these very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never worse timed, and there was no help for it, however. Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own was perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with as good a grace as she could. She was not better pleased with his gallantry from the idea it suggested of something more. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting to form a quadrille table at Rosings in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached a conviction, and she had observed his increasing civility towards herself, and heard his frequent attempts at compliments on her wit and vivacity. Though more astonished than gratified by herself by this effect of her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was exceedingly agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer. Until he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. If there had not been another football to prepare for and talk of, the youngest Mrs. Bennets would have been in a pitiable state at this time, for from the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was such succession of rain as prevented their walking to Meryton once. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after, and the very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. Even Elizabeth may have found some trial of her patience in weather, which totally suspended the improvement of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and was nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday endurable to Kitty and Lydia. Well, there we are. It's our 3 chapters for the day. Oh, Elizabeth is caring so much about looks of things. Foolish young one. Anyway, I will see you tomorrow for the next 3 chapters.